Life felt stable, like a house built on a strong foundation. Gwen and I had been together for over a decade, raising Noah and Lily in what I thought was a solid, happy marriage. There were routines we cherished, shared moments that brought comfort, and the occasional arguments that always ended with an apology or a laugh. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. That Thursday had been just another day. Work was its usual steady pace, Gwen was busy planning yet another PTA event, and the kids were gearing up for their school play. Dinner at home was a lively affair, the table filled with chatter and laughter. Noah couldn't stop talking about his role in the play, while Lily proudly showed off a messy drawing of what she called our family. Gwen, seated across from me, seemed entirely at ease, her laughter filling the room like it always did. After the kids went to bed, I decided to tackle the junk drawer in our room, a task I'd been avoiding for months. It was a chaotic mess of expired coupons, random cables, and documents we probably didn't need anymore. As I sorted through the clutter, my hand brushed against a folded piece of paper. It was a hospital record, and Lily's name was printed at the top. At first, I didn't think much of it. It seemed like one of those things you misplace and forget about. But as I scanned the page, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. Under Father's name, my name wasn't there. It was someone else's, a name I didn't recognize. My initial reaction was disbelief. There had to be a mistake. Maybe the hospital had mixed up records or someone had filed this incorrectly. I reread the details, hoping to find something, anything, that didn't align. But every piece of information, dates, birth details, matched perfectly. I felt like the ground beneath me had shifted. The paper trembled in my hands as I carefully refolded it and returned it to its spot in the drawer. I sat there for a moment, frozen. The warm, steady life I thought I had now felt like a carefully constructed illusion. As I walked downstairs, I saw Gwen sitting on the couch with Lily, helping her arrange glitter on a school project. She looked calm, natural, even happy. But to me, she suddenly seemed distant, like a stranger wearing a mask I used to recognize. That night, sleep eluded me. Memories I hadn't thought about in years came rushing back with unsettling clarity. Her frequent weekend trips for work that always seemed last minute, the late-night phone buzzes she claimed were from her sister, the subtle shifts in her mood I'd chalked up to stress. Each recollection carried a new weight, a sharper edge. I knew I couldn't confront her yet, not without more answers. If I was wrong, this suspicion could destroy everything. But if I was right, well, I needed to be sure. I resolved to take quiet steps, DNA tests for the kids, closer attention to her behavior. It felt like a betrayal of trust to even consider such actions, but the alternative was worse. Lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I felt the first fracture in the life I thought was unbreakable. Something had shifted irreversibly, and deep down, I knew there was no going back. After staring at the hospital record for what felt like an eternity, I carefully folded it back and slipped it into the drawer. My hands trembled as I pushed the drawer shut, trying to pretend everything was fine. My mind, though, was racing in 100 directions. I wanted to believe it was some kind of clerical error. That was the simplest explanation, right? Some mix-up in the paperwork? But the name on the document stared back at me, unshakable. The more I thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the unease curling in my stomach. I walked back downstairs and found Gwen with Lily. She was helping her glue sequins onto construction paper, her face calm and serene. Nothing about her seemed off. If she was hiding something, she was doing a damn good job of it. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Gwen was always involved in the kids' lives, attending every play, cheering at every soccer game. She didn't act like someone with secrets. But then again, I realized I'd never looked for any. That night, lying in bed, I replayed moments from the past few years. Her weekend trips for work, the ones that always seemed to come up suddenly. The texts late at night she said were from her sister. The occasional distant look on her face when I asked about her day. I remembered a time she'd come home from a work retreat, her energy unusually high, like she'd come back from a vacation instead of a training seminar. I'd brushed it off then, chalking it up to relief at being home. Now, those memories felt like puzzle pieces that didn't fit the picture I thought I knew. I couldn't confront her yet, not without more to go on. If I was wrong, I'd shatter the trust in our marriage over nothing. But if I was right, the questions began to multiply. Was it just Lily? Was Noah mine? The idea hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't let it go. By the time the sun came up, I had a plan. I'd get DNA tests for both kids. It would take time, but I needed the truth. At breakfast the next morning, Gwen moved around the kitchen like everything was perfectly normal. She handed me my coffee with a smile, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. She looked so at ease, so genuine. But as I watched her chat with the kids, I couldn't help but wonder if it was all an act. Had she spent years lying to me? Or was I the one seeing betrayal where there was none? I didn't know yet, but one thing was certain. I had to find out. By the weekend, suspicion consumed me. Every glance at Gwen felt heavy, every word she said seemed layered. On the surface, she hadn't changed, but now I was looking for cracks. Saturday morning, I took the kids on an errand run, stopping at the pharmacy to pick up 2 at-home DNA kits. Noah and Lily chattered happily, unaware of what I was planning. Their innocence made it harder to stomach. When Gwen left for yoga, I collected the samples. It felt like a betrayal of trust, but I couldn't stop myself. After sealing the tests, I hid them away to mail the next day. Gwen came home glowing, chatting about her class as if nothing was wrong. Her normalcy unsettled me. Later, while she tucked Lily into bed, I checked her phone, something I'd never done before. It was unlocked, and my hands trembled as I scrolled. Most messages were mundane, PTA plans, grocery lists. But one name came up more than expected. Alan. Gwen had mentioned him before, a colleague from her old job. I'd thought nothing of it then. The texts weren't blatant, but they felt too close. Inside jokes. Familiar warmth. One message hit me hard. I miss those talks. Things aren't the same without you. I closed the phone quickly as I heard her coming downstairs. It wasn't proof, but it deepened my doubts. Over the next few days, little things stood out. She flipped her phone face down when I walked in. She dressed up more for routine errands. The DNA tests were on their way, but I needed more answers. And I had to get them before Gwen caught on. The waiting was unbearable. I'd sent off the DNA tests, but the name Alan kept echoing in my mind. Gwen moved through our days with her usual charm, organizing events, laughing with the kids, and chatting with me like nothing was wrong. Yet every glance and smile felt loaded. One evening, she mentioned a charity dinner. It wasn't unusual. She loved those events. But the way she described it felt rehearsed. She insisted I didn't need to come, saying I'd be bored. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice, but now everything seemed suspicious. The next day, I checked our shared bank account. Most charges were normal. Groceries, yoga, kid stuff. But one stood out, a boutique hotel 2 towns over, dated 2 weeks ago. My chest tightened. That same day, she'd said she was at a PTA meeting that ran late. I'd believed her without question, until now. That evening, I tested her. Casually, I asked about the PTA meeting. She answered smoothly, even adding details about the bake sale discussion. If she was lying, she was flawless. But the hotel charge said otherwise. Later that night, while she slept, I searched her purse. Hidden beneath her wallet was a receipt from the boutique hotel, dated the same day. It was for a deluxe suite. My hands shook as I stared at it. The pieces were falling into place, but I still didn't have the full picture. Who was she with? Sliding the receipt back, I realized something chilling. Gwen wasn't just hiding secrets. She was covering her tracks carefully. Whatever she was hiding, it had to be big. The hotel receipt felt like confirmation, but I needed more. I couldn't confront Gwen without undeniable proof. In the days that followed, I watched her more closely. Every laugh, every glance, felt rehearsed, like she was wearing a mask I'd only now noticed. She mentioned the charity dinner again, her tone light, her demeanor effortless. It felt too practiced. When the night came, I followed her. Gwen left the house in a sleek black dress, her makeup flawless, her smile bright. After waiting 15 minutes, I got in my car and stayed a few cars behind. She didn't drive to the event venue but instead pulled into the lot of a small, upscale restaurant. It wasn't the kind of place for a large charity dinner. I parked and waited. A man arrived shortly after. Alan. She greeted him with a warm smile, and they walked inside, laughing like nothing else in the world mattered. I stayed in the car, my heart pounding. Confronting them then and there crossed my mind, but I needed to hold back. An hour later, they left separately. Gwen didn't go home. Instead, she drove to the boutique hotel linked to the receipt. Alan arrived minutes later, parking beside her. They disappeared into the building together. I sat in silence, the weight of what I'd seen sinking in. The truth was clear now. Gwen wasn't just lying, she was living a double life, and the cracks in her carefully built facade were finally showing. I sat in the car, staring at the hotel entrance where Gwen and Alan had disappeared. Every instinct told me to go after them, but I couldn't, not yet. My anger had to wait. Driving home, my thoughts spiraled. Gwen's lies weren't simple. They were layered, seamless. Her calm explanations, her flawless stories, they had kept me blind for years. The house was quiet when I returned. The kids were asleep, their peaceful faces a stark contrast to the storm in my mind. I checked on them, grounding myself with the one thing I still believed in. Whatever happened, they had to be protected. The next morning, Gwen acted as if nothing had changed. She laughed with the kids over pancakes, her smile betraying nothing. I tested her, casually asking about the charity dinner. Her response was flawless, detailed, confident, even adding small touches to make it believable. But I'd seen her walk into that hotel. Later, the tracker on her phone pinged her location at a cafe. I went, pretending to run errands. Through the window, I saw her sitting with Alan. They leaned close, her laughter genuine in a way I hadn't seen in months. It was one thing to uncover her lies in secret. Seeing her like this made the betrayal feel sharper, more real. That night, as she scrolled on her phone, I watched her from across the room. Everything about her, her movements, her presence, felt tainted. I couldn't keep this up much longer. The confrontation was inevitable. Her world was beginning to crack, and soon, it would shatter entirely. The truth was undeniable now. Gwen had built a web of lies, and I'd unknowingly played my part. The weight of it all sat heavy on my chest. I couldn't confront her yet, not without solid proof. She carried on as if everything was normal, smiling at the dinner table, helping the kids with homework, kissing me goodnight. Her composure made me wonder if she felt any guilt at all. I spent days gathering more evidence. While waiting for the DNA results, I tracked her movements through the app I'd installed on her phone. She visited strange places, quiet parks, secluded cafes, that didn't fit her usual routine. One afternoon, while she was shopping, I found a hidden email account. The messages weren't explicit, but their tone was intimate. Alan was more than just a casual contact. He was a confidant. She'd planned their meetings carefully, weaving them into her life as if they were routine. A fresh hotel charge appeared on our bank statement, dated just days earlier. She hadn't even tried to hide it, confident I wouldn't notice. Every discovery fueled my anger. I wasn't just uncovering her lies. I was building a case. She wouldn't be able to deny the truth when the time came. Pretending everything was fine became harder with each passing day. Every smile she gave felt like an insult. The kids remained blissfully unaware, and I promised myself I'd shield them from the fallout. The confrontation was coming. The evidence was stacking up, and my patience was wearing thin. The life we'd built together was already crumbling, and I knew the moment I confronted her, it would shatter completely. The DNA test results arrived earlier than expected. The plain white envelope sat on the kitchen counter, daring me to open it. With Gwen out meeting a friend, I waited until the kids were asleep before tearing it open. Neither Noah nor Lily were biologically mine. The words blurred as the weight of the truth sank in. This wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. Years of my life, my identity as their father, rewritten in an instant. When Gwen returned later, I was still sitting at the table, the papers hidden away. She breezed in, cheerful and relaxed, as if nothing had changed. Her composure stung more than anything. How could she move so easily through this world of lies? The next morning, I couldn't let it go. I combed through her phone again and found a name, Jason. The messages were old and vague, but there was enough to link him to the timeline of the kids' births. Each discovery sharpened my anger. How many lies had she told? How many people were part of this tangled mess? That evening, Gwen helped Lily with a school project, her laughter filling the room. Watching her felt surreal. She seemed so present, so nurturing, yet everything about her felt like an illusion. The next day, I called a private investigator. I needed clarity about Jason and anyone else who might be involved. The investigator promised to dig deep, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of control. But the DNA results still hung over me. I loved Noah and Lily, but this truth reshaped everything. Could I ever tell them? Should I? The cracks beneath my feet were widening, and I wasn't sure where the next step would take me. The private investigator worked quickly, delivering a file that unraveled everything. Jason wasn't a random name in her past. He was an old flame from years before we met. They'd reconnected about a year before Noah was born, exchanging emails and calls. Their timing made the truth impossible to ignore. Jason had even been in town twice recently. Once during a weekend Gwen claimed to be visiting her sister. It all lined up too perfectly. Jason wasn't just part of her past. He was likely the biological father of my children. I tried to keep calm, but it felt impossible. Every detail felt like another betrayal. Did Jason know about the kids? Was he part of their lives without my knowledge? Or was Gwen lying to him, too? She continued her routine as if nothing was wrong. Her laughter and casual chatter felt like a cruel joke. One night, she went on about a family trip we'd been planning for months, excitedly listing activities for the kids. I nodded along, but her words blurred together. How could she talk about a family she'd built on lies? The investigator called again the next day with more news. Jason had recently bought a house nearby. That revelation hit me harder than I expected. Had Gwen been planning something with him all along? The idea of her orchestrating this betrayal while smiling across the dinner table was almost too much to bear. I started noticing more cracks in her facade. She spent more time on her phone, slipping into other rooms for long conversations she dismissed as PTA business. It wasn't just the lies that stung, it was how confidently she told them. Her carefully constructed world was falling apart, and with every new piece of evidence, I felt the confrontation looming closer. The life I thought I had was gone, and the woman I thought I knew was now a stranger. The truth was coming, and when it did, there'd be no way to rebuild what had been destroyed. The days that followed felt like living in a pressure cooker. The weight of what I knew pressed against me constantly, but I needed to keep up the act. Gwen carried on as if everything was perfectly normal, juggling errands and PTA meetings, planning a family trip as if we were still the picture-perfect unit. She spoke with such enthusiasm about hiking trails and campfires that, for a fleeting second, I almost believed her. But the hotel receipts, the DNA results, and the messages wouldn't let me forget. The last puzzle piece was Jason, the man I suspected might be the father of one or both of my kids. His sudden reappearance in town raised too many questions. I started driving past his house, watching for any sign of her. It felt wrong, but I couldn't shake the need for certainty. On the third day, I saw her car parked in his driveway. My stomach churned as I watched her knock on his door. Jason greeted her with a familiarity that left no room for doubt. He embraced her before they disappeared inside. I waited, hoping it was a short visit, but an hour passed. Then another. When she finally came home that night, she breezed in with an excuse about a last-minute PTA meeting. She even kissed me on the cheek like nothing was wrong. For the first time, my facade cracked. My answers to her small talk were clipped, my tone sharp. She noticed, tilting her head as if to ask what was wrong, but she didn't push. Instead, she went upstairs, her calm composure unshaken. I couldn't follow her. Instead, I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror, searching for the man I thought I was, the man who believed in her. He wasn't there anymore. The house was quiet. The kids were asleep, and Gwen was in bed, scrolling through her phone like any other night. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. How could she lie so effortlessly? Downstairs, I poured myself a drink, letting the stillness of the house surround me. The confrontation was inevitable now. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. The calm before the storm is a strange thing. It feels peaceful, almost serene. But beneath the surface, everything is poised to shatter. As I stared at the wall, glass in hand, I realized I wasn't waiting for the storm anymore. I was the one about to bring it. The morning started like any other. The kids were getting ready for school, Gwen was bustling around the kitchen, and I sat at the table pretending to read the newspaper. My mind wasn't on the headlines, though. It was on the plan I'd been constructing for days. I wasn't going to wait any longer. The lies, the secrets, the false smiles. I'd had enough. It was time for the truth to come out, no matter the cost. When the kids left for school, Gwen turned to me, her usual cheerful tone masking any suspicion that something was wrong. She mentioned needing to run errands and asked if I needed anything. I shook my head, telling her I had the day off and would be catching up on housework. As soon as she walked out the door, I sprang into action. First, I retrieved the DNA test results and the hotel receipts I'd stashed away. Then, I printed out copies of the emails I'd uncovered, along with a photo of her car parked outside Jason's house. When she returned an hour later, carrying grocery bags, I was waiting in the living room. The evidence was spread out on the coffee table, a silent accusation that needed no explanation. Gwen froze when she saw it, her smile faltering for the first time in weeks. She set the bags down carefully, as if moving too quickly would make everything worse. I didn't say anything at first, letting the weight of what was in front of her settle in. Her eyes darted between the papers, and for a moment, I thought she might try to deny it all. But then she straightened her posture, her face hardening into something unrecognizable. "I don't know what you think this proves," she said finally, her voice cool, almost dismissive. Her calm infuriated me. I picked up the DNA results and held them out to her. She didn't take them, but she didn't look away either. "Do you want to tell me why neither of our kids are mine?" I asked, my voice low but firm. Her composure cracked, just slightly. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as if weighing her options. I could almost see the gears turning in her head, trying to decide which lie to spin next. "It's complicated," she said after a long pause, her tone softer now. "Complicated?" I repeated, anger bubbling to the surface. "That's all you've got?" Her expression shifted to something defensive. "What was I supposed to do? You were gone all the time back then, working late, traveling. I was lonely." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't even trying to deny it. Instead, she was justifying it, as if her actions were somehow my fault. "What about Jason?" I demanded. "Was he just another way to pass the time? Or is he their father?" Her silence told me everything I needed to know. "You had every opportunity to tell me the truth," I said, my voice shaking. "But instead, you built this entire life on lies. Did you ever think about what that would do to me? To the kids?" Her gaze dropped to the floor, but she still didn't apologize. "I didn't plan for it to happen this way," she muttered. "Then what was the plan, Gwen?" I asked, my frustration boiling over. To keep lying forever? To wait until I figured it out on my own? She didn't answer, and the silence was deafening. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing in front of a stranger. The woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone who had been hiding behind a mask for years. "I want the truth," I said finally, my voice cold and steady. "All of it. Right now." Gwen hesitated, her eyes darting to the evidence on the table. I could see the panic rising in her, the realization that she couldn't talk her way out of this. She took a deep breath, and for a moment, I thought she might actually come clean. But what she said next only added another layer to the betrayal. "You don't understand," she began. "It's not just Jason. There's more to this than you realize." My heart sank as the implications of her words hit me. The lies ran even deeper than I thought, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what was coming next. Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog. "It's not just Jason." I didn't think it was possible to feel more betrayed, but in that moment, the ground beneath me felt like it had completely given way. There was more. Of course there was more. "Start talking," I said, my voice sharp and cold. "All of it. Now." Gwen sat down on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up at me, and for the first time, there was something in her expression that resembled guilt. But it didn't soften me. Not anymore. "It started years ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before Noah was born." She told me about Jason, how they'd reconnected when she ran into him at a mutual friend's party. She claimed it had been innocent at first, catching up, reminiscing about the past. But then the late-night phone calls began, followed by secret meetups. She admitted that their relationship continued well into our marriage and that there was a strong possibility he was Noah's father. As if that wasn't bad enough, she went on to explain how her affair with Jason had ended abruptly when he moved away for work. For a brief moment, I almost believed that would be the end of her story. But then she hesitated, her eyes darting toward the evidence on the table. "And Alan?" I asked, not giving her a chance to stop. She nodded, her face pale. "That started later," she said, "after Lily was born. He was there for me during a difficult time. Things between us had gotten so distant, and I felt—" "Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't you dare try to make this about me." Her excuses felt like poison, twisting the knife she'd already buried in my back. She claimed Alan was a distraction, someone who understood her when she felt neglected. The words barely registered, drowned out by the rage boiling inside me. But then she dropped the final bombshell. "There was someone else," she admitted, her voice cracking. "It wasn't serious, I swear, but—" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It wasn't enough that she'd lied about Jason and Alan. Now there was a third man? Who? I demanded, barely keeping my voice steady. "His name was Mark," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "It was only once. A mistake. A mistake. That's what she called it. Just another name in a long list of betrayals. Another crack in the foundation of the life I thought we'd built together." My hands balled into fists as I tried to process everything. Jason, Alan, Mark. 3 names, 3 affairs, all overlapping the years we'd spent together. All the while, she had smiled at me, kissed me, told me she loved me. "Do they know?" I asked, my voice low. "Do any of them know about each other? About the kids?" Her silence was answer enough. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, pacing the room as the weight of her confessions bore down on me. The betrayal wasn't just about her infidelity. It was the lies she'd woven into every part of our lives. The children I'd raised, the love I'd given her, all of it built on a foundation of deceit. "You didn't just cheat on me," I said finally, my voice trembling with anger. "You stole from me years of my life, my family, my trust. And for what? Because you were lonely? Because you wanted something more?" She flinched but didn't respond. I turned away from her, unable to look at her any longer. The woman I thought I knew had been replaced by a stranger who had unraveled my entire life in the span of one conversation. And yet, I still didn't have all the answers. "Get out," I said, my voice cold and final. "We'll talk about what happens next later, but right now, I need you to leave." She hesitated, looking like she wanted to argue, but she must have seen something in my face that told her not to push. Without another word, she grabbed her keys and left. As the door closed behind her, the silence of the house was overwhelming. I sat down, staring at the evidence scattered across the table. The truth was out, but the damage it had caused was only beginning to sink in. Gwen's lies had torn apart the life I thought I knew, leaving me to pick up the pieces. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I could ever put them back together. The hours after Gwen left felt surreal. The house was silent, but my mind was anything but. I sat there, staring at the chaos on the coffee table. DNA results, receipts, emails. Evidence of a life I thought I'd known, now reduced to nothing more than a series of betrayals. Eventually, the silence became unbearable. I needed air, needed to clear my head. Grabbing my jacket, I stepped outside and started walking. The streets were quiet, the occasional porch light casting long shadows on the pavement. It felt fitting, somehow, to be surrounded by darkness. As I walked, my thoughts kept circling back to the kids. Noah and Lily didn't deserve any of this. They were innocent, oblivious to the mess their mother had created. The love I felt for them hadn't wavered, but the knowledge that they weren't biologically mine weighed heavily. What would I tell them? Could I even tell them? The thought of shattering their world the way mine had been shattered felt unbearable. By the time I returned home, the weight of exhaustion had finally caught up with me. I sat down in the living room, staring at the scattered evidence again. The anger I'd felt earlier had simmered into something colder, more calculated. This wasn't just about my pain anymore, it was about finding a way forward. The next morning, Gwen texted me, asking if we could talk. I ignored it. For once, the power was in my hands, and I wasn't going to let her dictate the terms. Instead, I called my lawyer. The conversation was clinical, devoid of emotion. I laid out the situation, explaining the affairs, the DNA results, and my intention to seek custody of the kids. She listened patiently, asking a few clarifying questions before outlining my options. Her advice was clear. I had a strong case. Gwen's infidelity, combined with the evidence I'd collected, would work in my favor. Even if the children weren't biologically mine, the fact that I'd raised them since birth meant the courts would likely prioritize their stability. It was a small glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. Later that day, I started packing. Not my belongings, but Gwen's piece by piece. I emptied her drawers and closets, boxing up everything that belonged to her. It wasn't an impulsive decision, it was deliberate, a way to reclaim the space she'd invaded with her lies. When she texted again that evening, I finally replied. I told her to come by the next day to pick up her things and that I wasn't ready to discuss anything further. Her response was brief, almost robotic. Okay. The following morning, she arrived, her face a mask of nervous energy. She barely made eye contact as she stepped inside, her gaze flickering toward the boxes stacked neatly by the door. "This isn't permanent," she said, her voice barely audible. "We need to talk about the kids." "We will," I replied, my tone firm. "But not today." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. For a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Whatever pain she was feeling now was nothing compared to what she'd inflicted on me. As she loaded her belongings into her car, I watched from the doorway, a strange sense of finality settling over me. This was the beginning of the end, the first step toward untangling myself from the wreckage of our marriage. When she drove away, the house felt emptier than ever. But for the first time in weeks, I also felt a sense of control. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could decide how to move forward. And that, at least, was something. The days after Gwen left were a blur of activity. Between meetings with my lawyer, work obligations, and taking care of the kids, I barely had time to process everything that had happened. But that was probably for the best. Keeping busy dulled the ache that constantly threatened to overwhelm me. Gwen had reached out several times, asking to meet and talk, but I kept my distance. The betrayal was still too fresh, her lies too vivid in my mind. For now, the only thing I cared about was protecting Noah and Lily. My lawyer had been clear about the path forward. Legally, I was considered the children's father since I'd been on their birth certificates and had raised them from day one. That gave me a strong position in the custody case, but Gwen's team would undoubtedly try to argue otherwise. The thought of her using the kids as leverage infuriated me, but I knew I had to keep my emotions in check. This wasn't about revenge, it was about doing what was best for Noah and Lily. The first court hearing was tense. Gwen looked composed as she sat across the room, flanked by her lawyer. She avoided my gaze, focusing instead on the papers in front of her. Her lawyer wasted no time in bringing up the DNA results, painting me as someone who might not have the right to claim custody. It was a low blow, but one I'd expected. My lawyer countered with the facts. I'd been there for every milestone, every scraped knee, every late-night fever. I was their father in every way that mattered, and no test could change that. The argument seemed to resonate with the judge, who acknowledged the importance of stability for the children. But it was clear that the fight was far from over. Outside the courtroom, Gwen approached me. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, but instead, she launched into a plea. She insisted that we didn't need to involve the courts, that we could work things out privately for the sake of the kids. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the person I'd shared my life with for over a decade. Her words sounded reasonable, even kind, but I couldn't trust them. She'd lied too many times, and I wasn't about to let her manipulate me again. "This isn't about us," I said firmly. "It's about them. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure they're okay." She looked like she wanted to argue but ultimately said nothing. As she walked away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Part of me wished we could find common ground, but I knew better. Over the next few weeks, the battle continued. Gwen's team tried to paint me as distant, too focused on work to be a fully present parent. My lawyer countered with character witnesses, people who could vouch for my involvement in the kids' lives. Teachers, neighbors, even my own parents testified on my behalf. It wasn't easy. Every hearing felt like reliving the betrayal, exposing the cracks in our family for strangers to pick apart. But I pushed through, fueled by the knowledge that Noah and Lily needed me to fight for them. Finally, after weeks of back and forth, the judge delivered their decision. Custody would be split, but I would retain primary custody, with Gwen granted visitation rights. It wasn't the perfect outcome, but it was a victory. When the ruling was announced, Gwen's face crumbled for the first time. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I couldn't offer her anything in return. As I left the courtroom, a weight lifted off my shoulders. The battle was over, but the journey ahead was still uncertain. I didn't know how to rebuild, how to move forward from the wreckage of what we'd lost. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could take a step in the right direction. For the kids and for myself. The house felt different now. It wasn't just the absence of Gwen, it was the quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the world feels raw but strangely peaceful. Noah and Lily adjusted faster than I expected. They were resilient, far more than I gave them credit for. At first, I struggled with how much to tell them. The truth about their parentage weighed heavily on me, but I decided it wasn't something they needed to know right now. They'd already been through enough. Instead, I focused on making our home feel stable again. I leaned into routines, school drop-offs, soccer practice, bedtime stories. It wasn't always easy. Some nights, I lay awake, haunted by memories of the life I thought I had. But every morning, the kids gave me a reason to keep going. Gwen's visitation days were strained. She was cordial, even warm, but there was an unspoken tension between us. I could tell she wanted to talk, to repair something, but I wasn't ready. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would take time. One evening, as I tucked Lily into bed, she asked a question that caught me off guard. "Are you happy, Daddy?" Her big, curious eyes searched mine, and I felt the weight of her question. For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. Was I happy? Not yet. But there was hope. "I'm getting there," I told her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Because I have you and Noah. And that makes me happy." She smiled, satisfied with the answer, and drifted off to sleep. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, life began to take shape again. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd lost touch with during the years I spent focused on Gwen and the kids. I threw myself into my work, not as an escape, but as a way to rebuild the parts of myself I'd neglected. One afternoon, I received an email from Gwen. It wasn't long, just a few sentences, but it carried a sincerity I hadn't seen from her in years. She apologized, not just for the affairs, but for the years of deception, for the pain she'd caused me and the kids. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She said she didn't expect it, but she wanted me to know she was sorry. I read the email several times, unsure how to feel. It didn't erase the damage she'd done, but it felt like a step, a small one, but a step nonetheless. I didn't reply, not right away. In time, I knew I'd find a way to forgive her, if only for the sake of Noah and Lily. They deserved parents who could coexist, even if the marriage was beyond repair. As the months passed, I found myself focusing less on the past and more on the future. The kids thrived, their laughter filling the house again. And while the scars of Gwen's betrayal would never fully fade, they no longer defined me. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the kids play in the yard. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. Life wasn't what I'd planned, but it was mine to rebuild. Brick by brick, moment by moment, I was creating something new, something stronger. And in that quiet moment, with the laughter of my children echoing around me, I realized I wasn't just surviving. I was starting over.